Hello, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to the third episode of the Literacy Center of Expertise podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Wilson, and I'm going to be joined today by Donna Clark, the lead here at the Literacy Center, and Lauren Hebert, a literacy instructor who is going to talk to us today about the topic of decoding instruction with literacy learners and how it's vital to reading and some strategies for teaching literacy learners how to decode effectively. So I'll start with welcoming Donna Clark. Good afternoon, Donna.
Hello, Jeremy.
Donna, would you be able to introduce our guest today?
Sure, of course, I'd be happy to. I guess I'd like to start by saying that, Jeremy, both you and I were invited to a webinar by the ECSD, which is the Edmonton Catholic School District. We were kindly invited by Diana Agudelo Cruz, and we had the opportunity to watch and listen to Lauren's. So, based on that, we were super impressed. Based on that, we got a hold of Lauren and asked her if she'd participate in this podcast. So, we're really happy to have Lauren here. I'll tell you a little bit about her. She holds a master's degree in TESL from the University of Alberta. She has a background in linguistics, having worked in a research lab studying psycholinguistics and language development. She's also an instructor of a TESL diploma course with ACE Education and recently began teaching a specialized reading course for literacy learners. Lauren is currently a CLB 1L teacher with ECSD LINC in Edmonton. So, hello, Lauren. Welcome.
Hi, I am so excited to be here.
Yeah, it's a really exciting thing to be doing these podcasts for the Literacy Center of Expertise. So, the webinar that we watched about you do, Lauren, was the decoding, and that's why we've asked you here to talk about decoding.
Mhm.
So, I'd just like to start with a question, and then we'll give you the floor here. So, for literacy students, they may be learning to read for the first time in any language. I think that most literacy teachers would agree that teaching adults how to read is very challenging. So, Lauren, could you start by telling us how to break down reading into manageable parts for our learners?
Yes, well, I will do my best because I think really this is the question for literacy instructors. At ECSD LINC, we labeled this year as the year of decoding because we had discovered that so many of our learners were still struggling with basic decoding skills, even at the higher levels. Even at 3L and 4L, they were really, just not able to decode in an efficient or fluent way. And we were kind of rediscovering this as we thought we had been doing an adequate job of teaching reading. But really, when it comes down to it, I mean, Emily did a great job last time talking about just like what is reading? How do we kind of attack this massive skill? And then even within reading, decoding itself specifically is just one element, and there's all sorts of pre-skills that learners need to have, and skills that like post skills that they need to continue to develop once they've learned to decode. So really, I think that we're all still figuring out the answer to this question. Now we have our wonderful documents, our ESL for All and the support kit that to my surprise, a few years ago, even though I had been using this document for a while, has like 13 pages of reading skills, a continuum of reading skills at the back, which I'll be honest, I had never read the back because I thought it was an appendix and I didn't really think it was super important. But nonetheless, if you go into that those continuum strands for reading skills, you will find pages and pages of very small print that outline all of the skills that learners need to be able to read. And so, wow, that's quite a lot of information. And I think that's where a lot of instructors start to feel overwhelmed. And so with that, and then with something like the Practical Guide to Teaching ESL Literacy out of Bow Valley, another wonderful resource, it does talk a lot about reading. But again, we're having to kind of, as instructors, mine out all these little pieces of what it really means in the classroom to teach our learners to read. And so I think the best answer I have for your first question, which was how do we break down reading into manageable parts, is really getting into this whole part whole methodology and taking it on within our teaching so that we're actually combining the broader meaningful context and then delving into that kind of functional pieces of language, that the graspable concepts that we can train learners in these skills. And that part is, it can be anything from all of those reading skills continua. It can be decoding, it can be like syllabification, it can be like higher level comprehension skills or vocabulary, whatever it is. But as long as we're like zeroing in on what's in the text, teaching reading as, a language skill, and then pulling out and looking at the whole meaningful context again, I think we're going to do a better job of really hitting all of this myriad of skills that our learners need to read, to decode.
Okay, Lauren, I just want to go back just a tiny little bit. Now, I think you may have explained it, but could you just again explain what whole part whole is for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is kind of a methodology for teaching literacy that has been around for quite a while. And really what it does is it tries to combine both the top-down skills and the bottom-up skills. So when we think top-down, we think kind of the schema that learners have, the context, the ability to, their cognitive abilities that they already have, their memories, their predictive skills, all those kinds of things. And then the bottom-up skills are kind of their senses, the things that they can see and feel and need to be kind of trained in. And so we always start with the whole, which I mean by like the meaningful context. So if we're talking about going shopping and needing to read a grocery list, well, we try to contextualize that task, that reading that's happening. So we talk about, where do you go grocery shopping and what sorts of things do you buy, and just really situate it in something that's meaningful for the learners. But then we're going to like zero in, I think of like taking a lens and like zooming way into that micro detail of, okay, what is in my shopping list? And maybe even more detailed than that, how can I read those individual words? And what I want to do as an instructor is really make the text that I'm providing for my learners very rich in the whatever skill it is that I want my learners to be developing. So if I want them to be practicing their short A sound, I'm going to try to put a whole bunch of grocery items that have that sound in there on that grocery list. Or I'm going to try to find a list that has specific vegetable vocabulary, because that's what we've been working on in class. So depending on, again, like the skill that I want to pull out, maybe it's 2-syllable words and I want to try to get them to identify 2 beats versus 1. So I'm going to do a combination of those in my list. And that's narrowing it down to really work on the language. And I think that's what I really want to emphasize today, is that it's not wrong as language teachers to focus on the language. I think we get a little lost in the task sometimes, and we're so excited that our students are so capable of accomplishing so much just through strategic abilities that, they can get by and really do so much, and it's wonderful. But it's also really important that we're giving them the actual language teaching that they're there for. They want the vocabulary, they want the grammar, and it's just it's a matter of balancing that within our task-based teaching. And that's where that part comes in. So that's where we have that opportunity to say, okay, now we're going to practice our short vowel ah sound, and let's start doing some manipulation with that sound and finding where it is in these words. And what happens when we replace it with a different letter? What sound does that letter make? And all those sorts of fun things that we can do. And then once we've kind of dealt with these kind of mechanical elements of the language, we pull out again to the whole, again, to the situation, and really giving learners the opportunity then to connect. Okay, I learned all these little details of the mechanics of language, but now I see how I'm using those skills. Now I see how it's meaningful and how I can actually go out and now use this skill in my life, and have it be situated in a context that they can connect with.
Great. So it's a transferable skill, right? It's not just specific to that one area that you're studying. It's actually studying language.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's super important, and I agree with you completely that sometimes we just get so bogged down with accomplishing one task, but this whole part whole helps you to extrapolate and then transfer those skills to other things. So that's an awesome approach.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the major benefit, is that we can spiral that through again and again in so many different tasks. We can look at the same uh, minor skill or sub skill.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, Lauren, because I think what'll often happen to students is there's so much that they're having to learn, like in whatever task that we're doing, that things can get kind of overwhelming, and whole allowing you to break that down into little bite-sized chunks that they can kind of deal with piece by piece, so to speak. Because I think we often take that for granted as native speakers too, that the ease of which we can to speak about these things or write about them or read about them, and those little tiny things, whether it be the pronunciation of one short vowel as opposed to the other, can really make a big difference in their ability to complete it. And I do see that students really, really like that, that ability to focus on those small things. They benefit from that.
Yeah, I think we do almost a disservice to our learners when we kind of withhold that from them, and we think that, and in some ways it's good for them to just get exposure. There's lots of theories of language learning that talk about, just expose them to tons and tons of language. The brain is amazing. The brain starts to pick out patterns, and we see that in the oral language ability of our learners. They are picking up language, many of them just from living in an English speaking environment. But they're so thrilled to receive specific instruction on grammar and phonics and things like that, that it really, they see these are graspable pieces of language. It's the clues to how to figure it out, and they're so thankful to have them.
Thank you, Lauren. I wanted to touch upon decoding a bit, because it's something that we hear a lot about in the literature around literacy instruction for adults, and kids as well, I guess. But could you just give us a simple definition of what you mean by decoding?
Yeah, for sure. Now, decoding itself is quite, again, a big topic, but I will do my best. I think really when I think about decoding, it's really, can my learners look at this little squiggle on a page and map that, so recognize it, say, oh, I've seen that before, map that squiggle to a sound that they have in their memory. And maybe they need to map that orally. Maybe they need to sound it out loud, which is great, because then they're receiving that kind of double feedback of their own voice being heard by their own ears to identify that symbol, or they're able to do it mentally. And then to take the sounds of different squiggles and put them together, blend them together to make a word. That's decoding. And it's incredibly difficult to even perceive of it being that detailed, because we read with such incredible ease. As fluent readers, our brains are doing amazing things. We don't even see really individual letters anymore. We just see shapes of words. I don't know if you've seen any of the research that shows how much detail you can take away from a word, and fluent readers can still read it because we have just our brains have been able to map these shapes of words, and we just access them instantaneously in our memory. Whereas our learners, they are going squiggle by squiggle to figure out what sound does that squiggle make. And can you imagine trying to remember just an individual sound? Sounds don't have meaning on their own, right? We don't really have a lot of single sound words. And so when you think about one sound, how do you remember a sound without attaching meaning to it? And that's why it's so hard. And that's why it takes so much practice for our learners.
Yes, I can understand that because I lived in Taiwan and was trying to learn how to read Mandarin Chinese.
Mm,
So I understand those squiggles can be quite challenging for sure.
yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's just a very, very simplified definition of decoding. So really all of the underlying skills required to be able to do that are vast, and that takes a lot of time and work for our learners. So, previously, they have to have the visual skills to identify these squiggles on the page. Do they have the ability to track from left to right? Can they see that there's a space between certain groups of squiggles? Do they know that a period doesn't make a sound, or that the dot on an I is not a separate sound than the rest of the line that forms the I? Like, there's so much knowledge that they need to have. Not to mention, they need to have all of the oral vocabulary before they can attempt to decode that word from writing. So if it's not a meaningful word that already exists in their mental lexicon, decoding it is not going to help they're never going to access the meaning. They need to have that meaning already.
Right. I've heard that so many times that they need the vocabulary first, right? Before
Mm-hmm.
we start teaching this. But it, do you, Lauren, when you teach decoding, are you also teaching all those other things you mentioned, like the period and the spaces and things like that? Are you teaching them separately or together? How are you doing that?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I think for me, what I've seen is that those skills need to be spiraled. They're not something that we can expect our learners to kind of learn once and be done with. So there's something that we have to continuously kind of return to. Maybe, of course, it will get faster for learners, and they just need a quick reminder. Oh, we don't actually say anything for the period, or did you see that there was a space between those two words? But they do need those kind of reminders. Now, we do like things like very, very basic vocabulary and those visual skills, tracking. That tends to happen at kind of the pre-CLB, the foundation level. But I do find that my learners need some repetition in a 1L class, and especially with the concept of a word that is not accessible because that's such an abstract idea. We speak in a stream without spaces between our words. And if you've never experienced written language, you wouldn't know that, oh, actually, we cut the speech stream up into individual words when we write them down. And so just that idea of one word equaling one referent in the world is quite an idea to grapple with.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I know that when I speak, I try to put spaces in between my words,
Mm-hmm.
but hadn't thought of it in that way, that you actually have to teach them that that word holds meaning by itself, even though that's not exactly the way we speak, right?
Yes, and neither is it the way that they speak in their language. That's kind of a function of having a written language that we can do things like label, which we don't really do orally. We never say cat, chair, table, right? We're talking about things in sentences. And so it's a whole new skill to label.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think, Lauren, what you mentioned earlier about the vastness of the continuum of reading skills, well, for reading and for writing, but especially for reading, and the fact that these don't necessarily parallel to the language levels, right? So someone might get to CLB 3-4 and they might still really struggle with one aspect of that. Like we could probably assume that they can start to, by that level, they would be pretty good at noticing what a word is, but you're not, a lot of that is not always guaranteed, especially with our learners. It's kind of like it's there one day and it's not the next. So do you find that this is something, a lot of these skills need to be repeated as they move up the levels, like even ones you wouldn't necessarily expect, like the visual skills and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I do think some of those beginning skills, like the visual skills, learning how to order things from left to right, those do become solidified the longer they are in school, the longer that they are practicing. And so they definitely need those reminders less as they move up the levels. But as soon as we get into phonological awareness, that's when we really see that must be recycled throughout all the levels, because it's not they're not able to pick up on it quite as quickly or solidify that knowledge in the same way as the other skills. And very reasonably so. We have a lot of different sounds in English, and we don't have one-to-one correspondence of our sounds and our symbols. So it's a very difficult task to have phonological awareness and be able to do some, phonemic manipulation. So it's not surprising.
Yeah. Now, I know when I first started teaching reading to adults, because that was really the first place I had to start teaching, I heard all these words going around, and you just mentioned one like phonological awareness. Now, when we start to do research and are reading these things, I think it's important that we actually understand the definition of some of these words. So I was wondering if you could just explain to myself and our listeners the difference between phonics, phonemic awareness, and phonemes.
Yes, for sure. Those are tricky terms. And even for myself, it was good to kind of sit down and remind myself, okay, what do each of these mean kind of in isolation? So I think it's easiest to start with phonemes, actually. And that's a term that comes out of linguistics. Phonemes are sounds of a language that make a meaningful difference between words. So if I have the word pat and cat, P and K are different phonemes because pat has a different meaning than cat does. Now, there are other sounds that we make that we can call allophones that are kind of the opposite of phonemes. They are sounds that don't have a meaningful difference, although if we were to analyze them phonically, we would notice that they actually are slightly different. But in our language, they're not considered different enough to make a meaning difference in a word. And maybe the best example is to think of for a lot of our Arabic speaking or Somali speaking students, the P and the B sound in their language are not meaningfully different. So if I were to say, I pat my friend on the head or I bat my friend on the head, for them, that P and B, that word would not have a different meaning because they map those two, what to us is two different sounds, they map to one sound. They can
Oh,
have that
yeah.
variation and it's not meaningfully different. And so in their language, those are not phonemes, whereas in English, they are. And that's why those sounds are so challenging for our learners, because they have to now differentiate between two sounds, which in their language don't need to be differentiated between. So those are phonemes that they're sounds that are meaningfully different. Now, phonics is, when I first thought about phonics, you hear it as this kind of outdated method for teaching reading from
Hmm.
ages ago. But really, all phonics is teaching the sounds of a language, the phonemes, and connecting them to the written symbols. So it's going down to the individual sound level and trying to train learners to make the sounds and blend them together to sound out a word. That's all that phonics is.
Right.
Um, and so then when we talk about something like phonological awareness, or I think we could say phonemic awareness is basically the same thing as phonological awareness. This is, again, just recognizing, producing, manipulating English phonemes. So it's, can you identify the sounds? Can you hear them? Can you make them? And if I were to say, now change the sounds, put that sound first in the word, being able to kind of mentally play with those sounds a bit, and then kind of make them in all their varied forms, because as we know, sounds change. The sound "a" in cat is not the same "a" sound that's in the word ban. Um, because those letters beside the "a" affect how we say it. And so even though we might think of it as the same sound, really orally, if we were listening super closely, we would hear it's really not quite the same. But learners need practice with it in all those different contexts to realize that, okay, that's not a meaningful difference. That's not a phoneme difference. It's the same phoneme with some variation depending on its context.
Wow, now I'm cognitively overloaded. But
Oh
I do it every day. I understand. Yeah, it all rests on the phoneme, right?
Yeah, yeah, it
So
does. Yeah, I think
so
if we're this overloaded, imagine our learners, right? Um, it is overwhelming, but the beauty is that there is some transfer from first language. So a lot of the sounds in English are the same sounds in other languages. So it's not like they're learning an entirely new sound system. The symbols will be different; they're new, but we have all sorts of strategies for identifying and remembering the different sounds and symbols in the language, and it's kind of fun when you get down to it. My students, in my class, I just call it spelling. I don't call it phonics or anything like that, because my learners were familiar with the term spelling, so I just, okay, we're doing spelling, and they're thrilled. They're so excited because this is where they get to play. This is where they get to, pull out manipulatives and play with making funny sounds and laugh at themselves and just enjoy the craziness of making weird sounds.
right, I think like we all did when we started learning language, right? That's
Hmm.
kids love manipulating the language in a way, and it's so fun for them. I agree. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you learned that you brought up phonemic awareness, because I know for myself, looking back, I haven't taught foundation for just over, maybe a year and a half, 2 years now,
Hmm.
and I look back on that time, and I realized that was the one thing I wish I would have spent more time on, and I think that my own language learning experience, like going to Japan and learning Japanese, there wasn't a lot of new sounds, and everything kind of mapped out really easily. There wasn't multiple spellings. And so it's kind of something that you take for granted when you start teaching, or especially literacy learners, because you just take it for granted. You think, well, no, I'm, you go to do a spelling or a dictation activity and they're making these mistakes, and you're like, I just don't understand. Why are they making these mistakes? But if they can't hear it,
Mm.
it's such a, it's almost impossible. And so I could see where, I could see the students being excited about doing those spelling activities, because it kind of gives them a key to that sort of thing, and everything kind of falls into place. And without explicitly teaching that, I could, you can just imagine how confusing and frustrating it would be for learners, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so valuable have your both of your experiences in learning other languages, because you have those kind of eyes to see that perspective of our learners when they try to come across these words, which to us it's so automatic to see and read something. We don't have to try at all. The word just presents itself in our mind when we see it, and it's so laborious for our students. And I think turning it into like almost like a code, they're code breakers, to try to
Hmm.
play around and figure out, what sound is that? And we've done all sorts of things to try to make it fun and very achievable for our students. So, whether it means, really just limiting your sound. So we're not trying to cover every single sound in English or every single symbol, but, for CLB1, maybe I'm just working on the short vowels. That's all right, and reviewing the consonants, but, that's my focus. And so I'm doing just tons and tons of games and activities where we're deleting sounds and adding sounds and cutting words up and listening for where is that vowel sound? Is it the first one? Is it second? And you can work it into your lesson so organically, and it just because we're dealing with language and tasks, it's there. It's just a matter of, can we pull that out and access it with our learners?
Well, I'm really glad that you had mentioned that about vowel sounds, because I know the vast majority of students have a difficulty with the short vowel sounds, whether it's A and E or A and I or E and I. They have a really hard time with those. So is there any, do you have any advice on how to help students hear those a little bit better, the differences between those two?
Yeah, for sure. And those are challenging. I think vowels themselves are hard, and we know this because linguistically, when we look at the actual mouth shape, I'm a big proponent of knowing what your mouth is doing when you make different sounds as instructors. I think this is really important because that's, again, a knowledge piece that we can give to our students that's accessible to them. But vowels are tricky because there isn't any definitive closure in our vocal tract when we're making vowel sounds. With consonants, there's a closure or a near closure to make all of your different consonant sounds. But with vowels, we just have variations in the shape of your tongue. And so we do have, whether it's at the front of the tongue or the back of the tongue, and then whether it's up or down, whether it's high or low in the mouth, that's the only differentiating part of how we make our vowel sounds. I can't show my learners, you need to, put your tongue right behind your teeth, like when you make a T sound. I can't do that with vowels. But what we've been working on, and in particular, one of my colleagues, Rose Elliott, has been doing so much work in putting together what she calls the keys to English. And she's been grouping the vowel sounds into kind of categories. So the front sounds she grouped all together because when we make the front vowels, which are E, I, A, and those are the sounds at the front of your mouth. When we make those sounds, we actually, to start with the first one, E up at the top, we have to make a smile. We have to open our lips kind of wide, but closed, like closing our teeth, because in that position, our tongue needs to be very high up in the front of our mouth. So to make an E sound, you have to smile. And so we start by showing our learners, look at the face that I'm making. Look at how my mouth is. And this kind of external visual cue, which is just helping them kind of clue into, where is my tongue? What is my mouth doing when I make this sound? And then as you make each of those sounds, E, I, A, we're actually opening our mouth a little bit wider every time. And so we can show them that each of those sounds makes one kind of step down with our tongue or with our chin to kind of, again, show that external outward cue. Other vowels like O and these are rounded vowels. So we have this lovely cue of, look at my lips. It's making a very tight circle. I'm making the O sound. And learners, they catch on to that really fast because they have that external cue. It's not just an ambiguous sound that they have to try to mimic. And then there's the big mouth sound. You have to open super wide. And I like using just lots of physical reminders of kind of what's going on in the mouth. So if I'm saying I'm putting my hands up in the air going like I'm yelling and I'm excited, or I'm going feels like my tongue is like a little bit high in my mouth, and I almost have to do a little shoulder shrug to make that sound. And my students, they catch on to those visual cues. And I think those are really beneficial to connecting with those, again, like I said earlier, those sounds that are not meaningful on their own. And how do you remember just a obscure sound if it's not meaningful. And so connecting it to some external visual cue, I think, is very helpful. So really what it's about is making it more salient. How do you like make those vowel sounds really obvious? And the other thing I would say is giving learners opportunities to experience that sound in different contexts. There's been some interesting research that actually shows that just learning, like, for example, apple, apple. Is the sound at the beginning of apple. It's learning just one instance, one case. They're memorizing that word, but they're not learning the rule of what is and how can it exist in the middle of a word or at the end of a word. And so giving them lots of opportunity to experience that sound in varied contexts is actually helping them apply it more productively. And so I'd say really training the sounds, training them to how to make those sounds with those external visual cues, and then not worrying so much about it being perfectly pronounced. I think I do want to be cautious and say we don't need our learners to have perfect pronunciation. What we need is for them to be able to differentiate between a and eh. So even if they're not quite saying it the way I would say it, that's fine, as long as they can say it differently from one from the other when they are reading a word and access their own mental lexicon, the vocabulary item in their memory. That's great. That's my goal. And so it's not so much about pronunciation as it is about accessing a unique sound that they have.
That's awesome, Lauren. I was making all the mouth shapes as you were talking.
Great.
But when we attended the webinar, you showed diagrams of the mouth, and I'm just wondering quickly, do you show students the diagrams of the mouth and the tongue placement, or?
You know what? I have actually, and it gets interesting kind of responses from learners. Some of them are super into it. Some of them are like, "Whoa, teacher, that is too much information. I don't want to see your tongue." But yes, I wouldn't show them like the official linguistic vowel chart or anything like that. But I might actually draw like a little sideways view of a face and show them what's happening. Yeah, because it's not obvious, right? I know as teachers, we're working really hard to make our sounds very clear and show our learners, what's happening in our mouth. But it's not always clear. There's a lot of stuff going on internally. I can't visually show you my k sound, my k sound. It's way back in my mouth. So if I can draw a diagram, or there are some really great YouTube videos too that show like a very up close video of somebody's lips, or even internally what's happening. So yeah, I have, and it's been good for some students. Some of them are gonna push back a little bit and maybe there's some embarrassment, I think, in having to explore their own mouths and figure out how to make these sounds, and it's a little bit nerve-wracking, but they learn, and they as they get comfortable in your class, and they kind of let some of those barriers down and start to just have fun, and it works really well.
Right. Yeah. I guess some of those images might be a little bit difficult for the students to interpret as well. But if you're drawing them and simplifying them, yeah, I think to approach it in as many ways as possible is the best thing for the students.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's so key in literacy, isn't it, Donna? That how many different ways can I show this?
Yes, we get quite creative, don't we?
We do. Absolutely.
I have another probably big question for you, Laura.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, like, you talked about you're working on short vowels. Do you know, like, at the beginning of the term, what phonetic principles you're going to highlight or teach? Or do you have it mapped out? Is there a certain order that you teach it in? This is like a multi-pronged question. Can you teach it in the wrong order? Does it have to be tied to the theme? Yeah, I guess I'm looking for just sort of a progression of skills and what order they should be taught in?
Hmm. I think that is such a good question. And for myself, maybe I'll answer in two different ways. I'll tell you kind of personally in my own class, and then I can kind of describe kind of more generalized principles for this. But
Okay.
um, for myself, I do have a set of what I'm aiming for, what I want my learners to be able to do when they are completing my level. But I am always also conscious that I'm going to have such diversity in my class, diversity of languages, diversity of, training. They might have come from another program where they did a whole bunch of phonics work, or maybe they've never done any sort of, phonics or decoding kind of practice. And so I'm aware that I'm going to have to differentiate it by learner and by where they are, where they're struggling, where they need help. And it's very interesting. I think this is one area where it's really easy to see where one learner, or one learner is struggling with. Um, we can do lots of different, little spelling tests, or listen and pull the sounds apart, or lots of game type things that we can really start to see, oh, yep, she's struggling with that R sound. It's so challenging. Okay, how can I show her that, how to make that R sound? Um, so I think it has to be responsive in a way to the learners in your class. But more generally, I think we want to start what is simple and salient. That's where we want to begin. So what is obvious to our students? I think there is really some really very interesting research that shows that even people who are illiterate adults who've never had schooling, they are able to identify rhyme, and they're also able to identify phonemic discrimination. So they are able to tell the difference between meaningful sounds in their language. And so starting kind of there with those skills and just getting learners comfortable and used to the idea of pulling apart sounds in language, pulling apart syllables. Can you hear that this bit of this word sounds the same as this bit of this word? That's a rhyme, right? And so just like some activities starting there, um, and we want to start simple and then move towards more complex. So that means we're probably doing consonants before we introduce vowels. And we're probably doing single consonants before we're blending, right? Those kind of very logical progressions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think overall, like there's so many sub skills, and I barely touched on things like blending and syllabification and rhyme and sight words and all of these things that kind of encompass reading and decoding skills. I think what we really want to do is start to divvy up all of those skills, knowing that we all want to, cover what as much as we can, but between levels. And this is something that we as an organization at ECSD have done, and it's accessible to anybody who wants to look at them. What
Okay.
we've done is created reading reference lists. So all of the instructors came together and went through the continuum of reading skills from ESL for All, and we divvied it up. We kind of said, yes, this one definitely I expect learners to be able to do at my level. This one, absolutely not. And we started to kind of pull them apart and tease them out and be able to kind of just for ourselves have some structure for what we were aiming at as a level. And their working documents, we're always kind of revising them and figuring them out kind of with each individual class that we have. But it's been so helpful as an organization to kind of move forward together, knowing that we all kind of know what we're responsible for in our level, and just to feel like these massive amounts of reading skills that we're trying to aim for. I don't have to cover absolutely every single one of them in my CLB1 class in my 4-month term or however long I have my students for. So that's been a huge help. And so maybe it just means, sitting down in your organization and saying, okay, how can we kind of divvy these up and what's reasonable? Because I don't expect a 1 or 2L student to be able to decode a trisyllabic word, and like
Yeah.
it's too much. It's beyond them, right? So we start to figure out, and I think there's some give there for sure, that some learners they're just skilled decoders. They just come in and they seem to just get it. And you're letting them kind of go on at a faster pace than some of your other learners in your class. So we're always trying to be responsive to what our learners need, but having a framework, a structure, is very, very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, one of the things I think for any new literacy teacher, when you look at that group of the continuum of literacy skills, it's overwhelming, just the sheer amount of knowledge, theoretical knowledge you have to kind of understand, but also like practically, how do you pull that into the classroom? It's almost like we could use another document to show, okay, what are some activities that practice this one? So I think the idea of you getting together with other people at different levels and kind of figuring out, because I know it isn't designed by level, but we kind of know that, this is probably going to be more important at this level, and trying to see that the differences there would be really, really helpful. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Is there anything else you wanted to add about the process of decoding?
I think I just would say that decoding is just one piece of the puzzle of reading. We don't want our learners to stop with the ability to just, do they know the sounds? That's not enough to read. And we know that we don't just need decoding ability. We need sight words. We need word families that learners are, we're grouping those sounds into common endings. And then it's productive. It's amazing how many words a learner can decode if they learn just the AT or ENT word endings, so starting to pull out like common affixes, or just training learners on sight words. We do a lot of work in low levels, as I'm sure you're aware of, just building up their vocabulary. Like that oral vocabulary piece is so important, because again, it all has to be contextualized in meaning, in a meaningful, real world kind of situation that learners can see themselves using this, see how it's valuable, and mapping it mentally. I think I'm a strong proponent of kind of a neural network model of how our brains work, that, it's all activations of networks. And so the more that we can connect the things that we're showing our learners, the more that we can say, okay, here's the meaning piece, and here's the, the sound piece, and here's the letter identification piece, and even how that word is fitting into the sentence piece. And all of it together is just giving them a richer and richer network of connections, so they can hold it. They can grasp it better with the more connections that they can make with it. So I think that's the challenge. That goes back to the very first question.
Yeah.
How do we teach decoding? What is decoding? How do we teach this? How do we break it apart? And I that's the challenge of being a literacy teacher. And it's exciting and it's so interesting. And we have so many options. And I think it's just a matter of trying to touch on all of them. Do all of these things with your learners, and build it into what you're doing as your everyday practice. And I read just another really, really great article that said, short bursts. This isn't about a 3-hour class on phonics. It's about these little bits of, okay, let's zero in on this sound and let's practice this for 10, 15 minutes, and then back to something totally different, because we overload when we have too much of just one very narrow mechanical piece of language. So it's short bursts often would be my take home of when to do phonics instruction.
Nice. Jeremy, I'm thinking we have to get Lauren back here, because I feel like we're just getting into it now. It's very exciting. So I think we're going to have a return guest.
Lovely.
Nice. So we're coming sort of to the end of our podcast here, Lauren, and I'd like to ask you our signature question. And this question is, because I think those who are literacy teachers come at it for so many different reasons. So I'd like to know, Lauren, um, why do you do what you do?
Great question. And I forgot you were going to ask me this, so it's truly this is from my heart.
Nice.
For me, when I was fairly young, I went and lived overseas for a year in India, and I had the experience of being in a totally new culture, dropped into the middle of the country, very, very isolated, with very little internet access, and I did not speak the language. And I had a volunteer position teaching English, and in that role, in that totally new culture, I experienced, true culture shock, like that, and that kind of whole body like overload of I don't belong here. What's going on? And that feeling, that kind of panicky, like overwhelm, that lasted for a long time for me, and it took me quite a while to feel like I was, surviving in that new place that was so, so different from everything that I'd ever known. And it it really affected me to the point where I realized that if I could do something in my life to help people who feel that way, I would really that would make my life really, really meaningful and purposeful. And so when I came back to North America, I started looking for ways to help newcomers, and that kind of became my focus and kind of the purpose of what I was doing. So when I came back to North America, I discovered that I could become an ESL teacher, and in that way I would have the opportunity to serve people who in a much, much worse situation than my own experience some of the same feelings, I think, that I was experiencing when I was overseas. And if I could in any small way make that process easier for them, I wanted to do that. So I just really fell in love with being in a multicultural context and getting to enter into my school and see so many people from different places wearing different clothes, just eating different foods, and just all of the ways that they bring their culture with them. I find that enriches my life so much, and being able to be a part of their journey and their the huge challenge that it is to integrate into an entirely different society is a gift to me. And I'm so thankful for my students every day. They bring me so much joy. So that's why I do it. And I love language. So it's a perfect marriage for me of, you know, loving people from other cultures and just getting to play with language as my job. I think it's pretty amazing.
I think we're pretty lucky as a community to have you here, and I'm sure your students are very lucky to have you as a teacher. That was awesome.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Well, we just want to say thank you so much, Lauren, for coming on today and giving us a little rundown about decoding, as well as all the other stuff you shared with us. I made a bunch of notes, so I'm really excited to go over this again and, go a little bit deeper on some of those things. So again, thank you so much from everyone here.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. And thank you for what you guys are doing. That is one thing I meant to say that I didn't, that I just love that you are bringing together so much knowledge from literacy instructors all over and making it so accessible. I think this is exactly where we need to go as a field. So I'm super excited about it.
Thanks, Lauren.
Well, that concludes our episode today. Thank you again to our guest, Lauren, and to everyone tuning in today. We hope you learned something you can apply in your class. From everyone here at the Literacy Center of Expertise, until next time.